Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. So, we've got the final exam on Saturday morning, which I'm sure is probably, you know, a little unsatisfying for you because it's the very beginning of the exam period and it gives you a little bit less time to prepare. But don't be too worried because I've got a final exam review guide that I created and that is going to be very similar to what the exam may look like. And what I decided today is that it would be useful for us to take a look at the review guide and discuss questions we have, but more generally, the content from this half of the course so that we can prepare you as best as possible for the exam. I don't intend to throw you any curveballs, but I do want you to pay close attention to the themes and the topics that we studied and be ready to also demonstrate knowledge from the reading. So we'll take a look at the review guide today, and I'm going to be sharing this with you, of course, as well. And we can take questions, address any issues that may appear to you as you get a first look at this, and just kind of get ready for the exam. We will eventually turn it back to the question of policy change and policy reform, which is our focus for this week. But because it is the last week of the semester, I don't have a long lecture for you or a great deal of content. Instead, we'll sort of put a pin on it and tie things together and discuss some of the big picture items and ideas that come from the policy reform discussion. So, this is where we are. Before we get started, let me address just briefly the response papers, the analytic essays. They were quite good. And for the most part, students really did well and were pleased with the results. It appears that you really did a good job using the reading and teasing out some interesting questions and insights. And in general, the grades were quite good, mostly A's and B's. And so very good outcome. If you're a student who is unsatisfied with your outcome, or if you're someone who would like to discuss this or address your paper, you're certainly welcome to visit me or email me. And of course, you can also reach out to Adolfo as well, the TA. We want to support you as much as possible. And that means talking to you about how you did and discussing your work with you. So some of you have already reached out to me with that in mind, and others may want to as well. So please do that if you want to. I would really look forward to chatting with you about that. But let's begin to bring our attention back to the review guide, and we can start to size up the final exam. Now, the final exam period is 3 hours. It's 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. And that, of course, is about, well, more than 3 times the normal time that we have in class during the semester. So the exam will be a little bit longer. There will be some more multiple choice, and there will be a few more response questions. But that being said, it won't be substantially longer. For example, I won't multiply the different parts of the exam times 3 and then give you 3 times what I gave you on the midterm. Instead, it'll just be a moderate, extension of the exam from the midterm, and you'll have more multiple choice and a few more response questions. So it will be a similar approach in terms of drawing on the reading broadly for some of the multiple choice, as well as drawing on the lectures, and then drawing on some of the short answer, short response questions that follow from the key topics that we addressed in the class. So some of those key concepts that you need to know, and that in general you want to be prepared to both write about and also connect to the reading or understand its role in the reading. The first concept is patrimonialism. And remember that this had to do with forms of rule that are deeply personal and have to do with decision making based on the personal relationships or interests of the ruler. And patrimonialism was really relevant in the case of post independence Africa, where a lot of these countries were unable to form and consolidate democracy and instead fell to these personalistic forms of authoritarian rule that oftentimes involved a lot of sort of clan and kin and tribe based relationships that would become sort of manifest in the governance of the regime, in the ruler in particular. Now we also talked about developmental patrimonialism, and this is where personal ties and personal relationships and interests still influence decision making, but in a more disciplined way, in a more coordinated way that involves this sort of centralized decision making about rents and public contracts, different policies of the government in the economy. And it has to do with making decisions based on the long-term investment priorities of the country and how patrimonial relationships can be leveraged to promote growth. Now, keep in mind that I'm not defining these for you. I'm just kind of putting them in context and reminding you of what they were generally. Now, the definitions that we worked with in class are much more specific, and we have pretty technical definitions that we drew directly from the literature on the political economy of development. And so you'll want to use those definitions. But even so, you'll also want to understand these concepts in context. And that's what I'm sort of doing here. We talked about foreign aid, and it's a form of development assistance that is at least partly non-military and has to do with certain kinds of social priorities or certain types of non-defense transfers to developing countries. We know that foreign aid has a long history and that there's a political economy of foreign aid. There are reasons that states give foreign aid, and there are reasons that countries become frequent recipients of foreign aid. We discussed all of that in detail in lecture. In particular, we talked about the potential for vote buying through the UN Security Council, and we also talked about the flow of donor money to countries that support or ally with key industrialized nations. The UN development goals we also discussed in the context of foreign aid. We addressed the question of whether foreign aid has helped to reduce poverty. We also talked about the relative influence of globalization and whether foreign aid or globalization mattered more when it came to achieving some of those goals. Formal institution is a set of rules, structures, economic or political activity. These are humanly devised constraints. They're sets of rules, the rules of the game that the actors and the players in the game must play by. And these formal institutions matter to development because we know that the institutions shape the incentives of the actors, shape their incentives regarding investment or savings, shape their incentives regarding productive activity or the behavior of the state. All sorts of important dimensions and elements of development relate to institutions. And so strong institutions are those that create certain kinds of incentives and that help to disperse power and more generally represent interests effectively, but compel behavior effectively. We know that strong institutions are effective because they substantially change the outcome relative to what the pre-institutional outcome would have been in terms of the type of behavior in which the actors engage in. So we gave examples like the example of mining rules and whether firms engaged in the mining of natural resources follow particular rules and engage in certain practices that are required. We gave other examples too, but that's just one instance. We talked about institutional strength. Institutional strength has to do with really the extent to which that institution changes behavior and produces an outcome that is different from the pre-institutional state of nature or the world as it was before the imposition of the institution. We learned about how to measure and gauge institutional strength by comparing the intended outcome to the actual outcome, and then comparing each of these to the pre-institutional outcome, and gauging to what degree in a sort of quantitative sense, the institution actually produces a change in behavior. And we measured that by looking at certain kinds of indicators that were relevant to the particular problem that we looked at. So we talked about property rights and what proportion of property or individual property owners are protected. We looked at mining rules and compliance with rules. We looked at the divestiture and privatization of military enterprises in Ecuador. We used quantitative indicators to assess strength in all of these areas. And so you should have a relatively sophisticated understanding of institutional strength and what that means and how we measure it. Coalitional strength is a closely related concept that has to do with the degree of political support for compliance with the rule, the institution. In many cases, there's an absence of coalitional strength. And as a result, the institution is quite weak because there's very limited compliance. There's very little support for compliance. In other cases, there's considerable institutional strength and there's considerable support for compliance with the rules. Coalitional strength is a very important variable then, and we discuss different sources of coalitional strength, different origins or different reservoirs, if you will, springs from which coalitional strength manifests and arises. These are important sources that you'll want to consider, and they included like strategic adoption. They included other variables that relate to the costs and the benefits of complying with the rules and the relative benefits of creating what can appear to be superficial institutions if you look underneath the covers and check out how strong they really are. Moving on, we addressed democratic transition, and we talked about how democratization is a political economy issue because it has to do with restructuring political institutions so as to improve and increase representation, so as to protect rights and permit the exercise of civil rights and liberties. It has to do with ensuring foundation for prosperity or the protection of property. A lot of the things that we consider essential to economic development more generally are also important parts of democracy. And so democracy becomes a development issue. And in that respect, we addressed two key variables or two key perspectives, I should say, theoretical perspectives on what can account for democratization. And really, these are economic theories of democratization. And I discussed two of them with you in particular. The first one was the social forces tradition, and it talks about relative class power and really the balance of power between the middle and working classes on the one hand and the landlords and capitalists on the other hand. And these groups have countervailing, contradictory interests that are in tension with one another. And so a democratic transition becomes more likely when the balance of power shifts and begins to favor the middle and working classes, who can then use their power to impose a transition to democracy. But a return to autocracy is more likely if the landlords and the capitalists have the upper hand, because then they'll use their power to defend the status quo and block the effort to democratize the political system. The economic approach is a little bit different. It focuses on the choices of the classes, whether to revolt or not on the part of workers, whether to repress or not on the part of capitalists. And the key variable is the level of inequality. And remember that as the level of inequality falls, the costs of a transition to democracy for the elites fall as well, because the resultant redistribution of wealth is far smaller than would be the case if the inequality was much higher. And if it was much higher, they would lose much more of their wealth because there'd be that much more to redistribute. But if inequality then is high, democratization is much less likely for that reason. And so these are two economic approaches to democratization. Both of them emphasize different economic variables, but notice that both of them emphasize essentially the same variables that we've been studying all semester long: economic development, economic inequality, class interests in the organization and the density of different classes, in the degree to which middle and working classes have formed as a result of economic development. In the case of the economic approach, inequality is obviously something, a variable that is affected by development. We learned that the Gini index is one indicator of development because it's a measure of the distribution of income and wealth within a society, in that more developed countries tend to have lower levels of inequality because they've begun to disperse that wealth and income more broadly, and they've created a wider set of opportunities for participation in the economy. And that's an indication of development from the perspective of Sen, who talks about capacities and freedoms. Finally, we addressed the political economy of authoritarian regimes, and we chose to focus on the one-party regime because of its durability and because of the fact that many communist regimes have survived, and because more generally the one-party regimes are more durable than any other type of authoritarian regime. And our key question was, what explains their durability? And we learned that politically, it's important to note that the one party model internalizes elite disputes because party cadres have no incentive to break off and form a new party. The party is the system, right? So they have an incentive to hold on to power and to internalize disputes. Whereas a military regime, by contrast, the leaders of the different armed services might peel off when they begin to disagree internally and when it begins to threaten the integrity of the military as an institution. So politically, the one-party regime internalizes elite disputes and it concentrates and incentivizes power sharing. And then economically, just as important, one-party regimes, they politicize public resources, right? So they use the state to dispense patronage and to build support in society and to develop loyalty in the working and among the working and middle classes, and essentially to buy off and co-opt much of society without using severe repression. So we discussed examples of China. We discussed other examples that also involve forms of organizational parallelism, like we see in China and Vietnam and Cambodia. We talked about Mexico and examples of corruption and patronage and using the state to basically purchase the support of voters. And one-party regimes, then, they survive because of their economic and their political mechanisms, their mechanics. They reproduce themselves because of the way that they sort of, if you will, they kind of permeate the state and the economy. And in this way, they prevent economic reform and they prevent political reform. And so this helps to explain the survival of the mixed economy in China. It helps us to understand the survival of statist policies in other one-party regimes where the state remains heavily involved in the economy. And it helps us to understand relatively limited repression in a lot of one-party regimes. Finally, we addressed the question of policy interests. And policy interests, remember, relate to economic reform. And policy interests have to do with the benefits that individual actors derive from their position in the economy. And it's important for us to know that policy interests represent an important obstacle to reform because the beneficiaries of the status quo are able to resist reform precisely because of the way that the status quo entrenches them in power politically and economically. And so what that means is to reform the economy, that means you have to form a large reform coalition. You have to reshape the interests of actors vested in the status quo. And you've got to alter the balance of interests and influence in some substantial way in order to reform the economy. But the new political economy of reform that Morrison writes about in the reading that I assigned for you is more generally a question of what is the role of the state and what sorts of policy interests come in tandem with this new role for the state in a sort of post-neoliberal era when reform can be orthodox as well as heterodox. That is to say, orthodox and traditional and conventional in the neoliberal sense, or unorthodox in the sense that reform actually expands the state's role in the economy and leads to more intervention in the economy, either in the form of state enterprises or price setting or making available credit to firms either through state-owned banks or by altering the money supply, you name it, right? These are the various concepts that we've discussed in this second half of the semester. And so that set of concepts logically produces a series of questions and analytical questions as well as more synthetic questions that have really helped to guide us in the class. And I want to bring your attention to these and use these to help you begin to think about the key topics that I want you to be prepared to write about. So, first and foremost, what is similar and what is different about post independence economic and political performance in Africa and Latin America? And how did politics affect economics and vice versa during those periods? As you know, one of the most important ideas in political economy is that politics shapes economics and then economics reshapes politics, and that they feed on each other in a way, and that this is what makes the economy political and politics economic. And so I want you to be prepared to potentially write about how politics shaped economics in Africa and Latin America, and how the post independence period in both regions uh, showed similarities, but also differences. And so this is going to draw on the lecture on post independence performance in those regions, but it's also going to draw on the reading that I assigned for this topic as well, which is very, very vivid and very rich in detail. And I really encourage you, if not insist, that you return to that reading and sort of double back and just review it as you prepare for the exam. Second, sort of relatedly, the concept of developmental patrimonialism. I want you to be prepared to assess and explain this claim that developmental patrimonialism promotes growth. Remember that this is sort of a adjustment of the original form of patrimonialism, which primarily relies on very personalist, short-term considerations. Developmental patrimonialism relies on long-term planning. It does retain the personalistic element, but it has a much longer term vantage point and perspective. And I want you to engage with the argument that this form of patrimonialism promotes growth. And remember that in lecture, we talked about the case of Cote d'Ivoire and how different time periods in the experience of that country help us to understand the importance of developmental patrimonialism and the particular institutions associated with that model. There was one time period when the country had that model, and another time period when the model began to break down. That comparative analysis that we did was very, very illuminating, and it's going to be useful for you to explore that. Then, moreover, I want you to also discuss the political requirements and conditions that this model really necessitates. What conditions must be in place for this model to really work? Does that suggest, moreover, that the applicability of the model might be limited? But that's all contained in the lecture that we did on patrimonialism. So I'd like you to return to that. Third, what is institutional strength and why is it important? There's so much there. It's almost a difficult question because it's so encompassing. Virtually everything in the class that we've discussed hovers around and centers on this idea of the role of institutions. The strength of those institutions and the extent to which they change behavior relative to what would have occurred in the pre-institutional world. The strength of the institutions matters because if the institutions aren't strong, government policy cannot guide or promote development. And we know that government and state policy is the key mechanism in the promotion of a development strategy. And so development in many respects hinges on the strength of the institutions and the ability of the rules to have teeth. But that's just a part of it. There's so much there, and I want you to explore it yourself. And I also want you to talk about what are the sources of strength? Why are institutions strong and why are they weak? To the extent that we study that question, what do we know about that? Number four, according to the social forces tradition and the economic approach, respectively, which economic or socioeconomic variables affect democratic transitions? What are the key variables according to these different theories? And this is an interesting question because it really forces you to think about these theories and these perspectives through the lenses that we've developed over the course of the semester. So you can kind of look at these in a sort of in a kind of surgical way and think of them in terms of the concepts that we've used so far in the course to understand the material. And then finally, number five, what is new about the new political economy of reform? Morrison writes an interesting article about how we've begun to reconceptualize reform, and there's been a shift away from the narrow, exclusive view of reform as neoliberal and market oriented, and that there's a increasing focus on both heterodox as well as orthodox variants of reform, in the idea that form can take a number of different shapes and sizes. I want you to be able to demonstrate knowledge and awareness of the distinction between the new and the old reform, and the way that neoliberal reform is distinct and different from the new, sort of more heterodox forms of reform that are more common these days, where states are responding to the economy in a much more sophisticated way by refining institutions and strengthening the rule of law, strengthening economic institutions, de- designing and developing state institutions with the capacity to support certain kinds of market exchange. All of this implies a very different role for the state than the neoliberal model ever anticipated. And it also helps us to understand, moreover, why some of the neoliberal reforms were quite limited in their success in terms of promoting growth. Because remember that the key point that we developed on Monday is that countries have different configurations of interests and they have different institutions. And so, what sense does it make to impose the same neoliberal playbook on every society? Even if every society takes the same model, the differences in the interest configuration in the political institutions will affect the application and the impact of the neoliberal model. And so it makes more sense to design a set of reforms that are tailored to the realities on the ground in the country in question. And so the Morrison article is very interesting because it talks about how even the World Bank and the IMF, for instance, since 2008, have begun to change their view about what constitutes reform. And this is a notable and important change in the debate because it means that now we can be more realistic about the things that governments and states actually do in the economy and with regard to development and reform. So that's an overview. These are the readings that I want you to work with and be prepared to demonstrate knowledge of. First, the Bates et al. Reading on post-independence performance in Africa and Latin America. Second, the Easterly reading on foreign aid. Third, the Brinks et al. Reading on institutions and institutional weakness in Latin America. The Acemoglu and Robinson piece on the economic approach to democratization. The Gandhi piece on political institutions under authoritarianism, and then the Morrison piece on reform. And again, you need to be able to demonstrate knowledge from these readings. And ideally, your responses to short answer questions that are likely to mirror many of the themes in these questions, your responses ideally will demonstrate knowledge of the reading and will use the reading in effective ways to exhibit your understanding of the material and show that you've gone above and beyond the lecture itself to educate yourself. And so this is what I expect from you. And as always, I want to be clear because I think that you benefit from going into the exam with some idea of what it will look like, because I want to ultimately evaluate your preparation and your performance and your work in the class. And in my opinion, in my view, part of that is your preparation for the exam. And so I want to prepare you to do well on the exam. And so this is what you should expect. You should expect the exam to be longer, as I said, than the midterm, but it won't be 3 times longer. It won't reflect the length of the exam period, but it will be a longer exam. And that will mean that it will have more multiple choice and it will have more short answer as well. Now, do we have any questions about this review guide or about any of the material on this review guide? Any questions? Victor's asking, would the final exam cover anything from other readings? No, Victor. The exam won't cover material from the other readings because there's been a lot of material in the class, and my view is that I tested you on the first half for the midterm, and that material is sort of the basis for the rest of the semester. So it's sort of built in, and the students who are articulate in that early material will also be well prepared to do well on the final too, as long as you put in the work. So no, I want you to focus on the readings that I list. And that means, you know, go into some detail in your review of those readings and focus your attention on them. Christiana asks, even though it won't be 3 times longer, we still have the full 3 hours, correct? Yes, absolutely. And I'll be available for the duration of the 3 hours. And you can ask for my help or whatever you might need. Yes, you'll have the full 3 hours, and you can use all of it if you want. Of course, if you're done quickly, you can be done quickly too. But as before, it'll be available through files on CAT courses. I'll make sure that it's available at the beginning of the exam time. As always, I'll probably post it a little tiny bit early, and then you'll need to submit it under the assignment tab that I create for the final exam within the 3 hour period by 11 a.m. And so that'll give you space to take the exam, and I'll be available for a drop in if you want to. But of course, if you don't have questions and you feel as though everything is straightforward, that'll be it. And the rest will be history. So I anticipate that you'll do well on this exam. You've done a good job in the class and you've hung in there. It's a class that involved a bit of a learning curve for all of us because we are engaging in a study of a difficult, complex subject. Political economy is politics and economics. There's law and history and philosophy. It's all in there. And you've done a good job and you've really improved over the semester. So I expect that you'll do well on the final exam too. Will I curve your grade at all? I don't intend to curve the grade. Any other comments or questions about this or about the exam? So I'll post this on, actually, you know what? Hold on. Let me just send it to you via the chat right now. And then I'll post it as well. All right, everyone, I went ahead and attached the final review guide to the chat, and go ahead and snag that, but I'll post it to CAT courses as well. And I just encourage you to to be ready for the exam. And yeah, you've done a good job this semester, and please remain optimistic. If you're a student who is still reaching and wants to do better, you've got a good opportunity, and just keep in mind that it's not over yet. So please continue working hard, and very satisfied and pleased with how things have gone. Oh, Matt's asking, I remember you mentioned that you could only fit in talking about economic policy towards the end. What was the other topic that missed out? The other topic that missed out was social development, or the state and social development. And the reading that we were going to do is by James Scott, who is this really interesting Yale political theorist, but who's written extensively about like um, weapons of the weak and how like nomadic people evade states. And it has to do with the relationships between groups and power structures. And it's an interesting set of topics and themes, but admittedly, it's the area that was on the syllabus that bears the least bit of relation to actual political economy literature. Sure, there's a lot in the literature about those kinds of issues, but this reading is actually not really an example of political economy. So when it came down to it, I ultimately chose to go with the policy reform topic. But if you want to read the James Scott stuff, it's really interesting, and I would just encourage you to go, take a look. I think the reading is still posted. It is more tangential. It is. Oh, thank you, Max. It's been a blast. I've really enjoyed this class. I love this class. Okay, everybody. So let's continue talking about reform. So this is my favorite subject in political economy, because if there's anything that elicits the objections of powerful actors, it's reform. And it's always vivid, the struggle that ensues. And this is where real politics takes place. Sure, the idea of reform or policy change, it's slow moving. It's less sexy according to some, but really it's profoundly interesting, because we're talking about the conflict of interests and the tensions that arise between different interest groups, and why states do or do not pursue reforms. And I talked on Monday about how deep reform was undertaken in a lot of the Central European countries, like the Baltic states, and that they were very successful in promoting pretty deep transformation in the economy in a number of sectors, but also in terms of the strengthening of institutions, the reduction of corruption, the strengthening of judicial institutions and independent accountability institutions that help to promote and strengthen other institutions. Just a really good example of growth and development and democratic consolidation and deep reform. Well, other post-Soviet republics in post-Soviet states, in particular closer to Russia, did not pursue deep reform. And instead, many of the post-Soviet states pursued much weaker reform. And this often entailed really the survival of much of the status quo, an extensive role for the state in the economy, relatively weak accountability institutions, lots of corruption, waste, patronage, cronyism. A lot of cases involved intense influence for oligarchs or elites in particular interests who were close to the authoritarian regime. And so in Russia, it's well known that the oligarchs swept up all of the privatized enterprises in the 90s. And what was problematic about that? Well, it contributed to the concentration of power, and it contributed to the monopolization of these sectors in these large economies. And that contributed to stagnation, poor services. It contributed to the deepening of corruption. It contributed to a variety of problems, the sum total of which was stagnation. And so unsurprisingly, shallow reform leads to bad results. And it's difficult whenever you don't go the whole way. There's this saying, the peril of partial reform. It has to do with how half starts and incomplete business can lead to just noise and bad outcomes because it's usually inefficient to stop halfway between one model and the other. It's usually better to just stay the course or rip the band-aid entirely off, so to speak. So for example, in Turkmenistan, they really just reformed some of the oil and gas interests, but there's still a great deal of institutional inertia in the system. And it's an example of shallow reform. Similar in Azerbaijan, oil and gas. In Belarus, the only real reforms undertaken were subsidized by Russia. And Russia's interests are deeply enmeshed with those of oligarchs who, again, are by definition, these barons, right? And economies don't do well when the institutions don't disperse power, when they strengthen the rule of the elites instead of weakening the rule of the elites. And so it should be no surprise that these weak, shallow, flaccid reforms don't produce good results. And we don't need to look any further than Russia. It's a country that it stagnates, and the post-socialist performance of the Russian economy has been quite poor. Now, of course, this stands in stark contrast to the rapid economic growth of the early years of the socialist economies. Remember that one of the benefits of the ISI model in Latin America was rapid growth. Well, that was also experienced in the socialist states too. And so, partly as a result, these weak reforms that have left them kind of in between the two poles have not been uh, positive in terms of the outcome, the economic outcome. So this is a good example of how power in institutions can affect growth, in how institutions have an important role and reforms have an important role in transforming economies so that productive activities and enterprises and investments in more competitive transactions and relationships can take place. So good set of examples from Eastern Europe and some of the post-socialist states. But some of the causes of growth in transition, this also raises an important question. When societies undertake these reforms and they begin to privatize enterprises or make credit available based on market signals or rationalize public spending or reduce public spending, whenever they do this, there's always an adjustment, and it's uncomfortable, and it can be many years before things return to equilibrium, so to speak. And that adjustment period usually involves increased unemployment because of the privatization of loss-bearing enterprises. And it usually involves a fall in wages because of the sort of adjustment that takes place in the fact that usually private firms have lower wages than state firms through these transitions. So then the key question becomes, well, why do some countries in transition grow at faster rates than do other countries in transition if the reforms are otherwise relatively similar, all told? And so what we know is that the institutional reforms matter a great deal. And so changing the rules and supporting and strengthening key state institutions matters a great deal. And so think about it like this. Even if you're privatizing firms, that actually does not imply a reduced role for the state. Why? Because the state has to design and oversee and coordinate the privatization process. The state has to defend and protect the property rights of the state in the course of the privatization process so that the gains and the benefits of privatization can actually be experienced and can flow back to the state. If you don't strengthen institutions prior to privatization, you get what Russia got, which is stagnation, monopolization, and a loss of competition and a missed opportunity to strengthen the economy. So institutional reforms matter a lot. Strengthening institutions that are central to protecting the property rights of the state. And that often means the treasury and other economic institutions that are involved in making decisions about these processes. Political stability also matters a lot. Those states that have, very peaceful and tranquil elections and transitions from government to government, frozen states, states with low levels of conflict, did especially well because that produces more certainty and it reduces some of the uncertainty and some of the transaction costs associated with the reforms, right? Because when everything is changing, actors cling to the things that are stable and stay the same. And so when politics remains stable, but the economy and the institutions are being reformed, the, the political stability can contribute to growth through the transition and often does. Now, states that are unstable politically often wind up suffering badly and don't perform as well because, all told, political instability just affects confidence and it affects all sorts of decision making in the economy. Initial conditions: countries that were richer in 1989 were also richer in 2017. So the countries that started off in a better position were also the ones that finished in a better position. This might not be as illuminating. It makes sense, and in some ways, it almost seems tautological. But even so, it makes sense that countries that began in a better position would ultimately wind up in a better position too. Natural resource endowments. Whenever countries rely a great deal on natural resources to generate public revenue, it militates against reform because the natural resource wealth, it sloshes around in the state and it gives the actors a great deal of incentive to resist reform because they benefit from all that wealth because they absorb it and suck it up and they claim it as a rent or as some sort of benefit that they deserve. And moreover, natural resource endowments are oftentimes difficult for transparency too, because sometimes the rules regarding uh, oversight or visibility or transparency of money and wealth and income within the state are the transparency is minimal, and that can complicate reforms because it makes them more uncertain. The legislators and parties who have to agree to reforms just know far less about the system, and so they're less willing to endorse or support the changes for political reasons. And then finally, European integration is another important cause. Those countries that had the prospect of joining the European Union had an external anchor or like an external obligation that motivated them to push through democratic and market reforms or state reforms that could strengthen transparency or the rule of law or just produce um, a more stable and sustainable path of economic growth. And so all told, this paints a pretty interesting picture and we get a better sense of what reform entails when we take care of state institutions and strengthen state institutions while simultaneously incorporating more of a role for the private sector or incorporating more of a role for market signals. What I'm hoping is that you took away from this lecture a more sophisticated understanding of reform in the idea that it's not strictly neoliberal in its orientation. It can also involve, and frankly, it needs to also involve state strengthening as well. Even if the state is getting out of the economy, it still needs to be capable of supporting and strengthening the economy in supporting property rights and supporting transactions and competitive relationships and also supporting the property rights of the state. In cases like Russia, that is not what happened. The state was incapable of protecting the property rights of the state. And so when those enterprises were sold off en masse in the 90s, particularly in the natural resource productive sector, the oligarchs sucked them up. And they did so at the expense of the state. And they did so at bargain rates in an environment that was rife with corruption and that wasted opportunity and potential that could have been reinvested in the Russian economy. And it's notable also to point out that the same thing happened in Argentina in the 1990s when they underwent their privatization spree and their neoliberal transition. The state institutions were largely too weak to fully protect the property rights of the state. And much of the privatizations wound up contributing to further monopolization in sectors, natural resources in particular, steel, but also just a loss of competitiveness compared to what they could have obtained through the reforms if they had just strengthened some of the state institutions a little bit further. Listen, everybody, we're out of time, and as always, I've kept you after. So I'll see you on Friday, and we will really wrap it up then and be looking at the very end. So I've gone ahead and shared the review guide with you, and I hope that you'll connect with me if you've got any questions or comments. But otherwise, thanks for everything, and I'll see you on Friday.